is Judges chapter 2. We'll start reading from verse 10. After that whole generation had gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up that knew the Lord, nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baal. They forsake the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and Asherah. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, and they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders, yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the ways of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up for them a judge, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But then the judge died, and the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them the nations Joshua had left. Left when he died. I will use it to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for the day that you've given us the opportunity to study your word. Guide us in all that we do. In your Son's name. Amen. Guess I shouldn't try to multitask. It's hard to see two different pages at one time. Right on one and read another. This morning, we're about to start a new series, starting this for our winter quarter. The title is Study of Samuel. As most of you know, we've been looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel on Wednesday nights. We've already gone through the 1st Samuel. We're actually studying 2nd Samuel in more depth related to King David. But this is a lesson that comes from Samuel. In order to kind of set this up, first of all, I want to kind of get a little setting. That's the reason I chose Judges as the first reading that we would use, even though the first lesson is taken from 1 Samuel chapter 1. But first of all, we need to understand a little bit where they were coming from and what Samuel is all about. Israel had been ruled by judges for close to 300 years. Not quite, but close to 300 years. They had lived loosely like clans or groups of families in different territories that they had settled in the land of Canaan. So for the most part, it was a group of people here and a group of people there that were loosely held as a people of God because they all together followed God and served Him. But as different clans, they were more structurally organized, set up that way. And so a lot of times when we looked at the book of Judges, the judge would rise up in an area with a group of people, not necessarily the entire people of Israel, but different places, different people, whatever. That's why we see different ones deal with different people of Israel. Okay? So they lived loosely in this kind of organization, which incidentally was pretty much the way the world operated at that time. There was no lot of big, massive kingdoms and nations like the United States and Russia and all these different things like we see today. It was more like that. Clans, families, groups, tribes. That's why they're referred to as tribes a lot of times. The Lord had taken them in the land of Canaan, and they were supposed to serve Him. He had given them everything, the covenant. They talked about the covenant. He had made with them as a people. And they were living in this particular land this way, through their fathers primarily, and through the priests that were put there to kind of, who were actually scattered throughout the land so that they would have a place to go gather to worship near their homes. the Lord had provided them everything they needed. Security. They come in there and defeated the enemies, wiped them out, did whatever it took, provided protection, provided them with land, houses they did not build. They moved right in and lived in them. He provided them food and farms. Everything it took to survive. Every single thing they needed. And the covenant that Moses had laid out was there with them. If you will serve me, I will provide and take care of you. If you don't, I won't. And that was basically the covenant that he made with them to be his people. So we see that during this time, God's goal was that he would be their God and they would be his people. That's what was intended. That's why it was set up that way in place. However, because they didn't follow his instructions right away, right there behind Joshua, and didn't go out and destroy the people and drive them out like he told them to, so that they would not be infected by the non-believer who was trying to always convince them to follow their ways, God said in the text we read that he used the nations around them to test them, to try them, to test their faith, to see if they would remain true to that covenant, remain true to him. But as we know from the book of Judges, which we've studied several times, they forgot God and chose to worship, it says, the gods of the people around them. Everywhere these people were, and their gods, whatever they were, they kind of embraced them and kind of moved into being part of everything. So they forgot God. Therefore, the Lord brought judgment on them. And he brought judgment through the use of their enemies, those around them. They would come and attack them and plunder them and take things away from them and cause them a lot of misery. And all the things that God said he would provide in that covenant was taken away because they rejected him and they chose to worship after the gods of those people around them. So he basically put them in the same category as the people around them. They got the same results of those gods that those people got. All right, but in their misery, they cried out, remembering the Lord, that they had heard about him somewhere along the line. They cried out to him that he would provide them with a deliverer. The deliverer was referred to as a judge. Someone who would come, make things right, and lead them in a way such a way back to God, first of all, and up to defeat the enemies of them, which were the enemies of God. Whenever they repented and returned to God, that's what repentance is, change of direction. When they turned and came back to him, he always brought them deliverance and victory, to show them that he was with them as long as they were with him. That was what the covenant was all about. This cycle repeats itself over and over for that 300 years we referred to, until the time of Samuel. Samuel comes on the scene, and if you'll turn to 1 Samuel, that's where we're going to start with this study that we're into. And this is where we'll be for the next 13 weeks, is in 1 Samuel. As we look at this, and we start looking at Samuel, Samuel was the last judge. There's a lot of unique things about Samuel. He was a prophet and a priest. So he carried several different jobs. I like to use functions because they come with titles, but they were a job that he carried out for God. All right? He was going to move them from a bunch of bands or a bunch of tribes, a bunch of loosely held family collections that all claimed allegiance to God, or were supposed to, and move them into what would become a nation. Something that was not real common, a large nation that was put together, that was ruled and everything. That was the job that Samuel was given by God. He would show them how God was to rule in their lives. They've been told, Moses showed them, Joshua led them, they illustrated, the judges would come and bring them back. And so he was here to show them this is the way God is supposed to rule in your life. Not just follow his commands, but rule in your life. More specifically, not just individually, but collectively rule his people. And how this relationship was supposed to be and how he would rule. And so we find that that's what he's going to do. Now, on Wednesday night, we're studying primarily what happened, the history, how it affected the chain of events in history and who it affected. I think last week we talked a little bit, or the week before, I don't know, I lost track of time. We talked about Rahab somewhere in there. and how they affected that, different things. Actually, that wasn't even from that period. Or was it? I don't know. Anyway, we've talked about the different events and how it affects and changes of history and everything. But the key to most of the study on Wednesday night is who did what, why, when, how. What I'm going to try to do here is not try to duplicate the history that we've been studying for the last thing. I want us to look at why is the book of 1 Samuel in the Bible. God gives us everything in the Bible for whose benefit? Ours. He doesn't write this book to give us a history lesson so that we can all be history professors. Yes, history teaches us something, doesn't it? Should. I guess they say history repeats itself because we don't learn very well. But basically, history is what happened is for our own benefit. That's the reason we're supposed to look at it. When God gave His Word, He intended it to be relevant to Scott Hawkins in 2016 years short. He intended it to be relevant to each and every one of us. So the question we need to look at this when we study these lessons is not just who did what, but what does that have to do with me? Okay? Because I believe everything that's written in here is for that. Many years ago, I've been teaching this for a long time. Many years ago, I used to try to avoid this Old Testament stuff. Why? A bunch of history, and I didn't really care about it. It's true. You know, I already learned it growing up. I was done. That's all I needed. I had my history lesson, you know, that kind of thing. But, being as I was teaching this class, and we've been using this book for 20-something years, I got to follow the book. And they kept coming to these things. I was like, I don't want to do that. But it taught me one important thing. It doesn't matter what it is, there is relevance to me today. Some of the things that we think don't mean anything. You know? And so that's what I want us to look at is when we look at that. This morning, we're going to start off, we're going to take a look at Samuel. Now, what do we know about the birth of Samuel? Who was his daddy? Anybody remember? I didn't read that. Do what? I don't either. So your guess. It starts with an E. No, actually, it does. Elkanah. He was an Ephraimite. What is an Ephraimite?
Tribe of Ephraim.
Tribe of Ephraim. Okay. Ephraim was the son of Joseph. All right. Remember, Joseph got two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. He got a double portion there. Ephraim was located on my map. I don't like to use Lloyd's. It's too accurate. On my map, just north of Jerusalem. And that area right in there was where Ephraim was basically located. And we find that he was an Ephraimite. And it was actually a large territory. I think it was the largest, or Manasseh was. It was one of the largest. And actually a lot of the history comes through that particular tribe. So he's an Ephraimite. He's a farmer. And he is located in this area near a place called Shiloh. Shiloh is in Ephraim, to the west of there, over toward the Philistine territory. Okay? And it's kind of near on the border between Philistia, and if you remember, it's the Gaza Strip, over in that part of Israel. And it's kind of over toward that direction. Now, what's so unique about Shiloh? I know it's a place in Tennessee, but that isn't it. It's where the tabernacle was located. All right, so after all this, and the judges, they came, you know, we always think about Jerusalem. Well, the first Jerusalem was actually Shiloh. That was the place where they set up for God to meet. And so here we go at Shiloh, and they live not too far from there. And this man has a wife named Hannah. Okay, so they're the farmers there, and so they would make an annual pilgrimage, maybe more often than that, but they would go to the place of God's house in order to worship and to offer sacrifices. So they would go to Shiloh. So as they go to Shiloh, which interestingly enough, did you realize that when Samuel was written, they referred to it as the temple? They didn't call it tabernacle. It's referred to as the temple. Why is that? What's the difference between the temple and the tabernacle? Tabernacle is mobile. Temple is permanent. It had been become permanent. As a matter of fact, Where was the priest? He slept in the house. He slept in the tabernacle. Does that mean he slept in the Holy of Holies? No. What has happened is the tabernacle is brought to there and located there, basically, and they built up structures around it that was referred to collectively as the temple. This is the place where Samuel would be raised. This is where Eli was. That's where they lived and ministered in the tabernacle, and they called it collectively the temple. So this was the first, or one of the earliest occurrences where it's referred to that way. And it's mostly because there were permanent structures built around it, even though it was still the tent, or the tabernacle, the actual place of worship was still there. Okay? So that kind of gives you a little idea of what's going on there. So this has become the permanent residence of the tabernacle, the place of God's worship, where He is. In that place of worship, we find where God sits, right? Where does God sit? On the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, between the two cherubim. This is the place where God would reside amongst His people. So this is what we find here. So we find that Hannah and her husband, Eli, what? Yeah, that guy. He disappears here in about 2 seconds. Okay, he becomes immaterial. So anyway, they do this, and they go over there, and as they're up at the temple, the tabernacle, and they're up there at the feast, we find that she is worried because she has an issue. What's her problem? She can't have a baby. She's wanted to have one for so long, and as the Bible shows many, many times, when you have more than one wife and one has something the other doesn't, the other one's ugly about it. And so there's some trouble there, and we find that Hannah is disturbed because she wants to have a baby so bad. And the Bible says that she's there at the temple, and she's outside there, and she's weeping and praying silently, and she's praying from the depths of her heart to God to listen to her pleas. You know what the people have been doing for a long time, and God would send them a deliverer. Here she is doing the exact same thing. So she's over here and doing this. Now Eli, he's leaning up against the doorpost in his chair, like I like to do a lot of times, kind of lean back from. As a matter of fact, it catches him later on. But so he's sitting there by the entrance of the temple and sees what she's doing, and he thinks that she's drunk. So he goes over and jumps all over and chastises her, and she basically says, no, you got it all wrong. And she starts explaining what she was doing, and she tells him that she has prayed to the Lord and she's made a vow. What's the vow she's made?
To give her son to the Lord.
Give her son to the Lord. Give him to the Lord for how long?
Lifetime.
For all of his life. That's the first thing she promised. The next thing she promised is that not a razor would be used on his head, which is what is referred to as a Nazirite vow. Basically, when they kept their long hair, and we think of a guy named somebody, Samson. It was a symbol of God being with him, a man and his hair. So therefore, it would not be touched. It would be committed to God for all the days of his life. That's the blessing. That's what she made a promise to. We find that Eli, when he finds out the truth, that he blesses her and her request. Okay, so he goes out, and they depart and go back to farming, back to Ephraim. And while they're out there, what happens? She gets pregnant. She's going to have a baby. The Bible says that she conceives and has a baby, and she names the baby what? Samuel. That's our study. Samuel, which means because I have asked the Lord for him. Because I've asked the Lord for him. All right. That's important to remember, because what are the people of Israel about to ask? They want a king. They're about to ask the Lord for something, and he's going to give them something. And it's interesting that Samuel's name reflects to that. We'll get to that a little bit later. But as we start doing that, start thinking in those kind of terms. That why is the birth of Samuel referenced here? Part of the plan. What about the birth of David? It's not mentioned. What about the birth of Saul? It's not mentioned. But Samuel's birth is mentioned. It's more than just about a boy being born. Otherwise, if it was a history lesson, then Samuel was born, and Saul was born, and it's not about that. It's more than that. Let me rephrase that. It is about that, but it's more than that. Samuel's birth is there for a reason. When we start looking at what's taking place here, we see that the beginning of the birth of a nation. Not just any nation, but what kind of nation? God's nation. Nowhere in the entire earth has this ever taken place. And it's about to take place. They're about to create what we call a theistic monarchy. Theistic because it's God. Monarchy because what? There's a king. And it's about God being king. Okay? A theistic monarchy is about to be established. God being king. Not just the father of their people, not just their God, but the king. Their king. Their ruler. And so they're about to establish this particular thing. And when we see Samuel's birth, it mirrors the birth of a nation that's ruled by God. We can see some of the things that affects that are related to that. Was this birth based on what man could do? Samuel's birth? No. No matter how hard she tried to get pregnant, she could not do it. And it was not because her husband didn't love her, because he loved her the most. The Bible clearly shows that he loved her so much he gave her a double portion of food, and the other wife got a single portion to spread amongst all her children. And she gets a double portion just for herself. He loved her. She wanted to get pregnant. It was not, they wanted it, but they couldn't do anything about it. It was because of that. We look at Samuel and his birth, and we start looking at God. God is the one that's going to produce that birth there, right? Guess what he did to that nation? He produced it. All right? It came from Samuel's birth came from a difficult and unlikely situation. All right? She was barren. She couldn't have children. And suddenly, God made it happen. Look at all these tribesmen scattered throughout this large territory here. Was there any structure or organization? No. Were they really even following after God? No. Depending upon the day and depending upon the person, kind of here and there. All of this, nothing about it set up to be one of the greatest kingdoms that would occur at that particular time. But God chose them and made it happen in both situations. Samuel and this nation. Remember, Samuel was born based on a vow. What was the vow? Be committed to him all the days of his life. Guess what the commitment God was looking for from his people when he made them a kingdom? That same commitment to belong to him all the days of their life. When we look at this, think about our country, or any other country for that matter, and its origination. This country here, I use it because it's often referred to as a Christian nation, or has been in the past. And we look at the origination. It was a bunch of states, loosely organized. Matter of fact, the first, if you know anything about history, which I try to avoid, Articles of Confederation tried to keep everybody loose apart, different whatever, and so therefore it had real structure and no good organization. But it came together out of nothing from very tough times and everything to become one of the greatest nations this earth has ever known. And a lot of the things can be attributed to because God blessed it. For whatever reason. A lot of it had to do with the fact that a lot of people looked at him. And the opportunities it did. I mean, even our entire Constitution and everything, the way we set up the government, had to do with things that would avoid the dictatorships, the monarchies, and all those dictator-type rules that the world is so used to. And we see how it takes place. And we see that as long as that covenant is placed, as long as this nation serves God, God serves it. Or any other people. Not just this country, but other places too. All right? Think about it also in these terms. What about Jesus when he came? What did he preach? The coming of his kingdom. Did it come through nice, easy terms? No. Did it come through most unlikely events? Clearly, you look at it and you see that somebody had to have a plan, and God had to have a plan and make it happen out of this mess. You know, people looked at it and said, how do you get that? And then suddenly there it was. Even Satan didn't even see it coming. And he was told it was going to happen. So we look at those things and we see how God turns around and makes a nation and makes things out of these things. Another lesson we'll think about. Romans 8:28. What's Romans 8:28 say? In all things, God works for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. And I've talked about this in classes before. A lot of times we use that and say, oh yeah, there's something in it for you that's going to be good. And I've said repeatedly, it's not about me. When we look at this, we can see in this, in all things, all this problem she was having, she was not able to have a baby, and all these things, God always starts with problems to accomplish His things. Think about it. Sarah, Rachel, look at all the barren women that were not able to conceive, that God allowed them to conceive in such a way that they knew it was special. Even Jesus, born of a virgin. Start looking at things. John the Baptist. You start looking at how God uses those just having babies. Look at all the other events God takes from unlikely things. Look at a guy named Saul. Not King Saul, but Saul of Tarsus. What an unlikely candidate. God starts with things and misery and problems and inabilities for a reason. Could Saul say he did it on his own? He knew he was in trouble from the beginning. He could not claim to be the greatest apostle. We look at him as he's so special. Look at all he's written and all this knowledge and all these great things, right? But the reality is he knew where he came from. God starts from things like that. All things.
He referred to himself as
Chief of sinners.
chief of sinners.
Absolutely. All things works for good. See, God doesn't work for bad. Sometimes we see the bad things in this world, and how many times does God get the blame? God doesn't work for bad. He works for good. He works for good. He produced a nation, a people of God. That's what He was producing in there. For those who love Him. Collectively. When He did this for Hannah, was He doing it just so that she would have a baby that she could rock and walk and spend time with all her days? No, she didn't get to do that. He got it for whose good? The people collectively that loved Him. God's people. And it was according to her plan, Eli's plan, God's plan. We can see when we look at that how everything comes about and is an illustration of exactly what Paul wrote when he wrote it, Romans 8:28. In all things, God works for good of those people who love Him and are called according to His purpose.
That's a good example of selfless sacrifice, too, because she wanted that baby so bad, and you know she hated to take it to the temple and leave it.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we'll find out next week that she didn't just do it right away.
Right.
Yeah? Yeah. I mean, mamas, you wouldn't give your baby away? That's tough. Right? But because God had done it, she had made the vow, and we'll look at that next week. But yeah, she does. Selflessness. All right, another thing. What about this Eli guy? What did he do? He sees her praying fervently to God, and what does he do?
Goes to a conclusion.
Jumps right on top of her with all 4 feet. I think the writer was wrong. He read the book. He was wrong. I think he was wrong. Shouldn't have done it. Why did he do that? Thought she was drunk, and being drunk was wrong, especially here at the temple, right? So in his self-righteous indignation, the priest that served at Shiloh, God's temple, he jumps right all over her for being drunk right there. Was that even close to being the truth? No. Jesus tells us, do not judge, lest you be judged. There's a reason for that. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 2 to stop judging because why? You're just a man. You're just a person. What do you know? Can you read the hearts of men? Matter of fact, I think Jesus went on to say that only God can judge his own servants. Don't judge another man's servant. So here we find Eli, who was by all accounts a very good priest and very godly man. You know, there's no dispute on that. But here he uses his beliefs and his religion, you know, and his godliness, and he jumps to a conclusion. How does that affect us when we do that?
Oh, we don't do that today.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. We don't do that. How does that make the other person feel? Does it make them feel like they want to be a part of God? No. Too many times, man jumps to those conclusions. You know how many wars were a hair trigger because they thought somebody said or did something? You know? All of it's because of what we think. We're making judgments about things we can't see clearly.
Do you
We
think he
look
was
at
wrong
that
for
and we
doing
see
this?
how it affects. Do what?
Do you think he was wrong for doing that?
Absolutely. Now, if he knew she was drunk, then he ought to call her hand on it.
Well,
But
that's-
because he thought she was, should he jumped on her? No. He could have gone up, and what should he have done? That's what the problem was. And if she was slobbering and falling down, and the wine bottle fell out, then okay, it's something we need to deal with. He didn't bother to find out what the problem was before he made the attack. That's what we do a lot of times. And that's what we need to avoid. Now, if she really was, which is not the lesson, then Jesus teaches us clearly you call it out the way it is. We need to deal with it in a loving way in order to cause him to change. But that wasn't the situation. The situation here was a judgment was made, and it shouldn't have been. What do we know about Eli's children? Undisciplined. Matter of fact, they were sleeping with the people, the ladies that came in to worship or whatever in order to get favors so that they would, that was his way of getting them to get favors or whatever. There was all kinds of things they were doing. Who was Eli worried about? A woman that he perceived to be a drunk, and he had enough problems in his own house to worry about. How many times do we have those situations? Don't we have enough problems of our own? Sometimes we're too busy trying to worry about everybody else's problems, and all we have to do is go look in the mirror. Guilty. What's wrong with that? That's a lesson we need to take from here. One of the most important ones was, what did she do? She couldn't have a baby, so what did she do? She whined and cried about it? She brought it before the Lord. Yeah, she was crying, but not the same as whining. She brought it before the Lord. She was praying. God tells us, and he demonstrates here very clearly time after time, that he listens to our hearts. There's a song that I like that talks about it, because it talks about listening to her heart. She wasn't saying words, couldn't hear them. She was just talking to herself and weeping and pouring out her heart. And God was listening to her heart, listening to what she had to say. Did God respond? Absolutely. Sometimes it's not always the way we think, if you will, but he always does. Look at throughout the book of Judges. He always responded when he heard the outpouring of their hearts. God listens to their hearts. In James chapter 5, we find that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Powerful and effective. In other words, it means it gets the job done, whatever that is. The prayer of the righteous.
And she probably didn't get that prayer anyway, and because the other woman had children.
Yeah.
So, that's ceaseless prayer.
It says that she had sons and daughters. Those are plural. That means at least 4 kids. Sons, daughters, if you take it literally. But she had multiple children over a year apiece. You know, you're talking a period of time. Do you think she was upset in making this prayer just one time? I don't know, but I would say probably not. If it was the deepest desire of her heart, she had been making it for a long time. Remember Sarah? Abraham? How many years was it before she had a baby? She was 100, wasn't she? Or he was 100, one of them. A lot of years. Okay? Matter of fact, Abraham had been promised it for many, many, many years. He was like, I don't see it happening. Let's go, man, get involved. Go make it happen. That's how we end up with Ishmael. All right. So we look at that. But also in that same verse in chapter 5 of James, it tells us to call upon who? What? In James chapter 5, the elders. The ones that God has given the responsibility to look after his people. Guess what Eli's job was? Look after his people. He was there in ministering and worship and things like that. In James, God's always been the same. Go to those who he's given the responsibility to look after his people. Ask them to step in and plead on your behalf as well. You know, we find that Eli steps up and blesses her and her prayer, her request. You know? Does God always do it just because an elder or somebody does praise? No. Sometimes it's according to his will, what he has in mind, and we don't have a clue what that is. But we do know that when you take it to those that God has entrusted to look after you, and that your souls and to worship with it, or to help you with those things in life, and you spread it to them, it helps. I would like to say in between too, not just yourself and not just the elders, but all of those in between that belong to God too. Take it to his people. You know, he talks about confession and calling upon others. I think it's about all. Take it to your brother, your sister, somebody you're comfortable with to help plead your case for you. All right? Power of prayer. We see it happen over and over again in our lives here, not just in the Bible, the written word we've seen there. All right, the last thing I wanted to touch on is this. Honor your word. A man is no better than his word. Isn't that an expression we've heard before or whatever? Seems to have gone away more and more, but that's always what it has always been. The Bible says, let your yeses be yeses and your noes be noes. Don't make a promise you can't keep. Don't swear by God or anything else, because you can't control that. Sometimes people make a promise and then they change their mind. Think of an illustration I've heard in the past about a rich man that was out sailing his boat. His boat flipped over and sank, and he was about that far away from land. He could see it over there. He was left to swim in. He was sure to drown all the ways. And as he's swimming, he's pleading with the Lord, you know. If you'll just get me to shore and keep the sharks away, if you'll do that, I'll give you everything I got. I'll give all my money to the poor. I'll help this. I'll do this. I'll do that. Makes all these deals. Don't we do that when we get in trouble? Makes all these deals, promises. I'll do this. I'll do that, or whatever. And he keeps swimming and struggling. As he gets a little closer, he starts and gets about halfway there. He says, yes, I know, I will. I'll give you half of everything I've got. You know? Promise, I'll give you half. And he gets a little closer, I'll give you some of it. I'll put some in the church on Sunday, I promise. I'll do this, I'll do that. And then when he finally gets to shore, he goes, well, I guess I made it on my mind on my own, so I don't really need to do anything there. The point is, sometimes we don't do what we set out to do. We make a promise and a commitment we need to do it, especially when we make it before God. And a lot of times when life and troubles come our way, we promise to do certain things until the troubles go away. Look at the book of Judges. When life was bad, they pleaded upon God. He sends them a deliverer. They would save him, and then, as soon as things get good again, I'm okay. See you. Isn't that what we do? We need to be careful about that. We need to be careful about that. All right. Anything else? All right. Next week we'll take a look at lesson number 2, and that's when Samuel is a young boy.